Chapter 4, The Hole, 1972. At 5 o'clock in the morning, I was startled awake at the opening of the food tray slot in the door. Breakfast was about to be delivered. The hole, as it's named for administrative segregation, ADSEG, consists of cells with just a bunk, sink, and toilet. Nothing fancy. My hangover from drinking the day before was still throbbing at my temples. It was cold and unusually quiet. After breakfast, it was all about reading books and waiting for the next meal. Later in the day, several of us were allowed into the enclosed and isolated exercise yard for an hour or two of fresh air and sunshine. One day while in the exercise yard, a neighbor in the hole introduced himself as George Jackson. Jackson had been there for a while and we ended up talking many times. I soon discovered he was an educated man, especially in the art of discipline gang style. Later on, word was out that Jackson and a group he was hanging with took over the adjustment center at San Quentin Prison, which is on the first tier. The adjustment center is like a maximum security lockup hole. Jackson and his group supposedly killed several guards with guns that were smuggled in by his attorney. During the disturbance, knowing he was a marked man, Jackson sacrificed himself for others involved. He was shot and killed by guards for trying to escape, or so they say. My 30-day punishment was coming to an end. I went back to committee and my release date was adjusted by 18 months for disciplinary action. I was returned to the mainline population. Crackers and I eventually drifted apart and sought out friends to hang with. He ended up with a more questionable crowd of sorts. He got rolled up and transferred to Susanville Prison up near the Nevada border. I started hanging with a different caliber of people, including a guy named Flacco, who I also knew from my CYA years. Flacco was housed with Crackers and Lassen. We were all socializing and trying to pass our time to escape the boredom of everyday prison life. Lifting weights, playing chess, or just walking laps around the yard. Anything to make the day go by. I was getting a drink of water at the fountain one afternoon when little Danny from Salinas struck up a conversation with me. I met Danny for the first time in Soledad. He asked me if I knew Flacco well. I told him well enough and asked why. Little Danny informed me that Flacco was very influential and connected with a very bad crowd known as the Mexican Mafia, the M.A., which is one of the most active prison gangs. I didn't mention anything to little Danny at the time about the friendship between Flacco and me. As other gangs were being established, members of each one needed to be identified as to their affiliation and allegiance. This was accomplished by having a tattoo, or writing of the gang insignia placed on a specific part of the body. Larry was from Salinas and a member of the Nuestra Familia, NF. On day, Big Albert from San Francisco, also an NF member, and I were sitting on the grass, kicking back and talking when we were interrupted by Larry, who casually joined in the conversation. After a few minutes, Larry pulled Big Albert aside and asked him if he had his writings yet. Big Albert told Larry that with all the other tattoos on his body, he didn't have room for one more. About this time, Flacco had noticed some fresh tattoos on other NF members. Flacco, being a friend, approached me during a recruiting period and offered me to sponsor me if I wanted to join his affiliation, MA. I told him I had other personal projects going on at that time and wasn't interested in joining, but I let him know if I changed my mind. Each new member had to be sponsored by a current member to join a gang. The hot summer of '72 was in full swing and the tension between rival gangs was escalating. The tension was so great, it would only take a smirk, a wrong look, or a misunderstood word for the yard to explode. And then it happened. A guy named Joe Boy from the Avenues gang in Los Angeles and his second in command, Artie, were associates of the MA. The following happened in just a few short minutes. Bozo and Lugo were transferred from Folsom Prison to Soledad to reorganize the NF. At this time, both the NF and MA were at war in the prison. Also, the Aryan Brotherhood, AB, and the MA were allies with each other. Both yards had a mix of gang members living together. Joe Boy and Artie, MA, were on the 2-yard, along with a lot of other MA members, as were a couple of guys named Charlie and Little Albert from Watsonville, NF. One Sunday morning, Charlie snuck over to Yard 1 through the back of the kitchen and told Little Danny that Lugo just got stabbed in the back by Woody from the AB. Lugo had his heart punctured, and even though he was mortally wounded, he had enough strength to go from his cell down the hall to the shower, where he collapsed in Bozo's arms. Little Danny and I were having breakfast when word came down from the Godfathers, Little Danny, to have Flacco hit in retaliation for Lugo's death. Little Danny immediately left me at the table to go take care of business. After chow was over, I was exiting the dining hall. As I was exiting the dining hall, I looked across the yard to Rainier Hall, where a crowd had gathered. A group of inmates were pushing a gurney with Flacco on it across the yard to the infirmary. I saw Flacco with a knife in his chest and knew he was done. Just then I saw Bruiser, a 300-pound guy, and Diamond from Fresno, both NF members, heading for the water fountain on the baseball field to clean up and wash blood off themselves from killing Flacco. As if what had just happened wasn't enough, the NF Godfathers told Flapper from Stockton and Little Danny to hit 2 more MA gang members who had come over from the 2-yard to see the action. Little Danny refused to participate in hitting 2 MA members, so I volunteered to go with Flapper to do the hit because Flapper was my friend and I didn't want him to go by himself. We were supplied with a couple of knives from the NF members and socks to wash the blood off in case we got any on us. Because of what was happening on Yard 1, tension and anxiety was as high as ever. The 2 MA gang members saw Flapper and I approaching them and hastily retreated to their own yard via the control gate, never to be seen again. The weapons that were used for the hit on Flacco came from some of the NF members that had gathered at Rainier Hall. They had disappeared into the background through a group of NF members, with the exception of the knife Flacco had in him. You'd be surprised how easily weapons can blend in anywhere and not be discovered. Both yards were locked down while the investigation was going on. All suspected and known gang members, about 60 in all, from both yards were gathered up and sent to the hole pending investigation and disciplinary action. This was all new to me as far as being a suspect in gang activity. Needless to say, my anxiety level was high, not knowing what was going to happen. The hole was designed so that a row of cells was facing west, with a wall down the middle separating the east-facing cells and a utility vent in the wall behind the cells. The administration decided that for the protection of everyone concerned, it would be best to keep the gangs separated to prevent further bloodshed. After 2 days in the hole, I noticed that everyone on my side was NF members, and on the other side, the MA members were housed. Being all of 19 of us, old and new to this gang stuff, I was a little nervous and unsure of myself, not knowing all the do's and don'ts yet. I had mixed emotions about all that had gone on and had no idea what was going to happen next. I had friends on both sides and wasn't officially in any gang yet. After I started talking to some of the MA members through the vent, I was quickly reprimanded by one of the NF and told not to communicate with the enemy. I was thinking then that my mind had already been made up. I was going to join the NF gang. We all knew that emergency transfers to other prisons to break up the groups was going to happen soon after. Sure enough, 2 buses pulled up behind R&R and we were all off to our next destination. Our property would be sent at another time. Diamond and Bullwinkle from Sacramento asked me to go with them to Susanville, but I didn't have a choice in the matter. We were told we'd be going to Susanville, but at the last minute, Bozo, Robert, Big Albert, a few others, and I were sent to San Quentin. The other NF members, Little Bobby, Larry, Little Albert, Little Danny, and Bruiser, all ended up being transferred to DVI at Tracy. All the inmates were sent to Folsom Prison. I lost track of a lot of those guys and didn't see them for a few years. Bozo and I were seated together for the ride to our new home. Needless to say, my anxiety level jumped when I found out where I was headed. Because of all the rumors about San Quentin and everything I'd heard about the horrors behind the walls. Bullwinkle, Fat Mike, Ray, and the others were loaded onto another bus and sent to Susanville. Unfortunately, those souls going into Susanville were not as lucky as the rest of us. That shit quelled any of the rumors about there only being one Mexican Mafia member that was killed by the NF. This book was written by Fig from Hayward, so this guy lived in that era, was a member during that era. At the same time, this other cat, Mundo, claims that all that stuff was happening during the time he was still active. So I guess it's just a matter of who you believe.